Okay.
Got it.
Today's speaker is Alex Norris. He's a Montreal City Councilor since 2009. He was previously an award-winning journalist, a researcher, and a translator. As a news reporter, he covered everything from city politics to foreign affairs, and has won several of the top prizes for journalism, both in Quebec and in Canada. He has also trained journalists in 7 countries as part of an international anti-corruption initiative. Since his election as a councillor representing Montreal's Plateau-Mont-Royal borough, Alex has served as chairman of the Montreal Island Police Oversight Body, the Public Security Commission, as an associate councillor to the Executive Committee, as the interim mayor of Plateau-Mont-Royal. He's been on the board of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and as chairman of Quebec's 9/11 Agency, and as vice chair of the city's standing committees on transport and public safety. I don't know if there's a committee you haven't been on, Alex, but you're doing well. He's currently serving as leader of the majority on the Montreal City Council, and he takes part in the executive committee meetings as a non-voting member. Tackling the climate crisis is Alex's top priority. He's committed to expanding green space, cycling infrastructure, and public transit citywide. He's led a successful decade-long fight to ban advertising billboards in the Plateau borough. Besides French and English, he also speaks Portuguese and Spanish. So when you come in with your questions, don't be shy. He's lived on the Plateau for more than 35 years with his wife and his 2 sons. And with that, Alex, I'll pass it over to you. You've got about 20 minutes, and afterwards we'll pepper you with questions.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to your meeting. It's an honor to be able to speak to you, and a kind of a pleasure and a privilege and a bit of a treat to be able to address a group in English, in my mother tongue. I'm used to working in my second language. So when Tony contacted me about this, he said that I shouldn't really prepare anything too formal. So I haven't prepared a formal address, but I will speak to you a little bit about my experience in politics, how I got into politics, what my motivations were, what my experiences have been so far, and I look forward to exchanging with you informally, and feel free to ask me questions, even to interrupt me and ask me questions if there's some burning issue that you want to ask me about as I'm speaking. So I first sought public office in the 2009 election. I'd worked for 16 years as a staff reporter at the Gazette, a couple of years at CTV on a public affairs show, a few years freelancing as well. But I was ready to do something else. And, since I arrived in Montreal in 1987, I've always lived on the Plateau. And I saw an opportunity with the rise of Plateau-Mont-Royal. At the time, it wasn't by no means a sure bet that I or any of my colleagues would be elected. We had only one elected councillor at the time, who was the leader of our party at the time, Richard Bergeron, who narrowly won election to his seat in 2005. But he was the lone voice for Plateau-Mont-Royal at the time in council, and it seemed almost a quixotic battle to try to seek election with that party, even if the political culture and demographics of our borough were quite favorable to our party and its priorities. So at the time, there was a serious ethics crisis that was racking City Hall. There were rampant allegations of corruption in the Tremblay administration. There was something resembling a pay-to-play scheme of political financing, where it had been shown that the majority of companies whose directors and employees had made donations to the mayor's party went on to snag public contracts. There was a problem of a lack of transparency in public oversight of the police. We also faced significant local problems concerning traffic. We had an average of approximately 1 person hit by a vehicle at an intersection somewhere on our borough every day. requiring transport to a hospital by ambulance. So this was a major source of concern in the borough, and there was considerable built-up frustration over the inaction of the previous administration to tackle these issues. You know, we faced a situation where there was a lot of talk about grand principles, about traffic calming, about pedestrians' rights. There was the pedestrians charter that was adopted. There were all sorts of statements, and what the person who was to go on to become our borough mayor, Luc Ferrandez, called the discourse industry, where people evoked, virtue signaled, and issued documents upon document, evoking the importance to act, but weren't actually making change on the ground. So, you know, I think part of that inaction resulted from a fear of an understandable fear of a backlash on the part of businesses in particular, but also residents. So it took a certain amount of courage to take the swift action that we took, but we were elected on a campaign slogan at the time saying, we will do it. Nous allons le faire. We're going to do it. We're not just going to talk about it. We're going to actually act to make changes quickly and swiftly on the plateau in order to make it a safer, greener, more inclusive borough. So to our delight and somewhat of a surprise, we swept the borough in that election. All 7 candidates were elected to the 7 positions that were open on the borough council, and I was one of those councillors who took part in the first elected Plateau-Mont-Royal administration anywhere in the city. And we did act swiftly. You know, the borough mayor became something of a lightning rod in Quebec. Was depicted in mainstream media as something of a madman who was hell-bent on fighting cars and making life difficult for people who wanted to get around the city. We didn't see it that way. We saw it as more of a quest to make our street corners safer, to reclaim space that had been dedicated practically exclusively to motorized vehicles, and give it back to human beings, give it back to other purposes, to other uses, be it traffic calming, be it wider sidewalks, more trees, bigger parks, more cycling lanes, more protected bike lanes, more reserved bus lanes, and so on. So, you know, at the time, this was seen as very radical, and Luc Ferrandez in particular was really, as I said, became something of a lightning rod, became something of a national figure in the Quebec sense. He was on TV a lot across the province, and we moved to do a number of things very quickly, to redirect traffic off local streets onto the arterial streets, to take cars off the 5-meter prohibited zone at intersections where, you know, the Quebec Highways Code requires that in order to assure good visibility of pedestrians and other users of the roadway and intersections, that no one be parked within 5 meters of an intersection. But this rule was systematically flouted in our community and across the city of Montreal. And so we started building curb extensions that created physical impediments to people parking there, and in order to make these intersections safer. We also took out some parking lots that were located within some of our parks and greened them over. We took some streets right out of parks. Marianne Street used to bisect Baldwin Park in the east of the plateau. We took it right out and greened it over. And we did this in a number of locations, and put in new bike lanes on some of our local streets, and planted a lot of trees, put in a lot of bike parking, did a lot of things that progressive, environmentally minded municipal administrations in big cities around the world have been doing. But from a Montreal perspective, it seemed radical at the time. And to be quite honest, when 2013 rolled around, at the time we were up for re-election, we were by no means convinced that we were going to be re-elected. I think dominant narrative in the media was that we were probably headed for certain defeat, that we had upset just too many people with too many changes that were too radical and came too fast. However, in the following election, we all were reelected with increased majorities, and the Projet Montréal caucus actually doubled citywide. We went from 10 councillors to 20. We went from being the second opposition to the official opposition in the following mandate, and that was the mandate in which Mr. Coder was elected by a narrowly elected mayor with a minority administration on council. And so it became, we took on a larger role in opposition, and we continued making changes locally on the plateau in the same direction, taking space that had been dedicated exclusively to cars and putting it to other uses. As well as making changes to protect some of our more vulnerable residents, to promote social housing, to protect rooming houses, and so on. So all of this coincided with rising worldwide concern over the climate crisis. And so our party, which had initially, while we had a strong green image and we were, environmentally minded, much of the impetus for our original moves on the plateau came from community groups that were more concerned about safety at intersections, traffic calming, the need to make our streets safer for vulnerable users of the roadway, pedestrians and cyclists and public transit users in particular. But we were very lucky in that even though we were elected citywide to a minority position in opposition for our first two mandates, we did have a borough to govern. And the Plateau has over 100,000 people. It's like a medium-sized city. Many of the powers that the boroughs have in the city of Montreal are quite considerable, particularly when it comes to local streets, local services, local parks, and urban planning in particular. One of the things that we did early on was something that you and Westmount did a long time ago, which was to ban advertising billboards in our community. The advertising industry fought back with great determination, claimed that we had violated a fundamental right to freedom of expression, freedom of commercial expression by not only banning all future billboards, but requiring that the existing 45 odd billboards that littered our landscapes be all taken down within a year. That ended up being a court battle that lasted a decade, but we ultimately prevailed at the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court declined leave to appeal a ruling by the Quebec Court of Appeal, which upheld our bylaw as a reasonable infringement, a reasonable and justifiable infringement on freedom of expression, on the grounds that fighting visual pollution is a valid and urgent public policy objective that in a borough such as ours was perfectly legitimate to pursue. So in order to do this, though, we had to also generate some new revenues. And we made some moves that were also very controversial at the time. We hiked parking meter rates from $2 an hour to $3 an hour. In our borough, we increased the cost of parking vignettes as well, all of these moves caused considerable controversy. One of the big changes that we made was redirecting the traffic that used to come down Christophe Colomb and circle around Laurier Park and continue down Christophe Colomb all the way to the Gay Village and the TV district of the city of Montreal. This enraged a lot of people who were used to taking that route, but it proved very popular within the community most affected. And I remember at the time speaking with the daughter of a former city councilor in Toronto who said, "Don't worry about this, it'll all blow over. My dad did the same thing in the annex in central Toronto years ago, and there was a similar backlash, but ultimately locals appreciated it, and she turned out to be right." And so we've continued in that vein locally. I'm now on my fourth mandate, fourth four-year mandate, and certainly we've gone much farther than I ever expected we would when I first started out. And I think that it's evidence that, you know, when it comes to municipal politics, individuals, like-minded individuals can band together in a political party, make alliances, and effect change without necessarily having a lot of powerful, big money backers behind them. That was certainly our case. We started out really as a shoestring organization. I remember back in the day, you know, our leader, Richard Bergeron, would draft press releases. I would translate them into English. We would tweak them a bit and we would put them out ourselves and try to get attention. And, you know, over the years, we've professionalized. Now, you know, as we've grown, we have been able to hire political staff. And since we took office under the leadership of Valérie Plante in 2017, taking office citywide, of course, you know, the party's become much bigger. And we have, you know, we've now governed most of the boroughs in the city of Montreal. We're in a majority position now. And, you know, that was, I guess that was the big breakthrough when we won office in 2017. But in many ways, that growth has continued, I would argue, in the last election in 2021, because not only was our, you know, did we reinforce our majority, we were reelected with a bigger percentage of the popular vote and a larger majority in council, but notably, a number of other large municipalities across the province also for the first time elected environmentally minded administrations that look to Projet Montréal as a reference. I'm thinking of Catherine Fournier in Longueuil, of Stéphane Boyer in Laval, the new mayor, Mr. Marchand in Quebec City. We're seeing in Sherbrooke as well, Granby, a growth in the number of environmentally minded administrations province-wide. So, you know, that's been very heartening, and I consider myself incredibly privileged to have had this opportunity to serve the community. Unlike provincial and federal politics, municipal politics is very terre-à-terre, very grounded in the day-to-day, and the impact of what we do is very tangible. It's not, you know, foreign policy and fiscal policy, monetary policy. They have a huge impact on our lives, and nobody would deny that. But you don't, when you step out the door, you don't see the impact of these decisions in your daily life. Whereas in municipal politics, when you put in a curb extension that gets rid of an illegal parking space that somebody used to use, well, you hear about it. And I had people call me all sorts of names when I would go and explain these decisions. You know, to this day, we still face resistance and backlash from time to time with decisions that we make, but we've made a practice of going and trying to meet people who are affected by the decisions that we make, particularly when it concerns merchants on a commercial street. I'm thinking of Pine Avenue, for example, which is now under reconstruction. It's a project that I personally have fought for over a decade. And I'm really delighted to see, because that was a really awful street. That was something of a scar that split my own district in two. A treeless, miserable street with tons of asphalt, very narrow sidewalks that were uncomfortable to use, no bike lanes, no trees on the public domain. That street is going to be completely transformed. It's going to be a beautiful street with 140 trees planted along that avenue between Saint-Denis and Park Avenue. And we're going to have wider sidewalks. We're going to have unidirectional protected bike lanes and big, generous curb extensions at each intersection. It's going to be quite a radical road diet. In order to lay the groundwork for that at the beginning of the last mandate, we eliminated all the on-street parking spaces on that street, which is a pretty radical thing to do on a semi-commercial street. to my surprise, we didn't really face much of a backlash. There was a bit of one. There was one merchant who came to Borough Council to complain. I went and visited him and have a very good relationship with him, and talked it over with him. We went outside his store, and I said, "Do you like the street? Do you really like the street the way it is?" Because we're close to downtown, because roughly half of the households in our communities do not own private vehicles. And because we're well served by public transit, we have 3 metro stations in our borough. We have a terrific bus network and a growing and improving cycling network as well as, and this is something else, and another innovation we introduced, widely available car sharing through Communauto, both the traditional model where one books online, goes over to the parking lot and drives it back to the same parking lot, and also the self-service model where you can geolocate a car, reserve it, drive it to your destination, and leave it behind. These are innovations that we developed on the plateau and then spread throughout the city through agreements with other boroughs, including Côte-des-Neiges, Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, and it's a network that's spread throughout the city now. So we have a population that is open to these kinds of changes, that is not entirely a captive to the car economy and to car culture. And so we're very privileged to have been given the opportunity to try these things out. I like to argue that, in our decentralized system of municipal governance that we have in Montreal, that boroughs are something of public policy innovators. We get to try things out at a local level. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work as well. And we also watch what our other boroughs are doing in the community. In Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, after we took office, the elected borough mayor, who had been elected with Madame Arel, with Vision Montreal, across the floor, joined Projet Montréal. We then had a new majority on that borough council. And they started doing interesting things. With white roofs, green roofs, different, public policy innovations when it came to urban planning issues. And they've also been very successful in installing a really ambitious network of bike lanes as well. They have generally wider streets than we have on the plateau, so it's something that's easier to do without losing parking spaces. But I tip my hat to them because they've taken some risks as well and have done some interesting things. Other boroughs are doing likewise. We've seen a rise in the number of boroughs and independent municipalities that have severely restricted the use of gas leaf blowers, for example, something that we're also considering doing. So I would argue that this decentralized system of municipal governance allows more creativity. It's a less brittle system. Whereas, when you have one centralized government for a big mega city, as they have in Toronto, well, any reform that's going to be put in citywide takes years of planning and debate, and often fails because of various sources of resistance that may not exist at the local borough level. We get to try things out. And, so to my delight, many of the things that we developed on the plateau have now become somewhat taken for granted citywide. Another of our innovations was to put restaurant patios, or terraces as we call them in our unique form of English that we speak here in Quebec, on the roadway, taking over parking spaces. Now that at the time, that was seen as far out, that it hadn't been done before, and not in the city of Montreal. There was a pilot project on Mont-Royal Avenue, but that was about it. And we made it the rule for the entire borough on commercial streets where terraces were allowed that they could take over parking spaces. They had to pay a fee that reflected the commercial value of that space because it's a privatization in a way of that space. Those terraces are open exclusively to customers of these establishments, and they make money off that space. So that became also a source of revenue for the borough. But we also developed Another model that we coined the term placotoir, kind of a combination between placoté and trottoir. And these are public patios where anyone can go. You don't have to be a customer. You can sit down, and those are free of charge. Merchants that want to put those up can do so. They have to get approval from the borough, and we have guidelines. They have to be universally accessible and so on. But many businesses that, places that sell ice cream, for example, or other types of businesses that have takeout, they see it as being in their interest to create a public space where people can go, not only their customers, but other people can go and socialize. And often what we find is that merchants tend to radically overestimate the percentage of their customers who arrive by car, particularly in central neighborhoods like ours, where the vast majority of people are actually on foot, using public transit, coming by metro, coming by bus, coming by bike, and motorists are actually a small minority of the customer base. And so if you take a parking space or two and convert it into a public space, while that generates a backlash, can generate a backlash at first, oftentimes merchants come to embrace this as good for business. A great example of that I can give you is, and you probably know, Fairmount Bagels on Fairmount, the public space that we created near there at the corner of Clark and Fairmount. We eliminated 3 parking spaces and created a seating area with greenery, and you should see the crowds that gather there now. All the businesses are happy. There are lineups for the ice cream store. The Italian cafe on the corner is always busy. The bagel shop just, it just keeps running as it always has. So it's an example of where taking away a few parking spaces and converting them to something else has actually served to benefit merchants in a significant way. And these are trends that you see worldwide. There are other municipal administrations that are far more radical than ours, and that have gone much more aggressively in this direction. I'm thinking in particular of Paris under Anne Hidalgo, the current mayor, who's eliminating, thousands and thousands of on-street parking spaces to convert them to greening, to bike lanes, to reserve bus lanes, and so on. New York City, under Mayor Bloomberg in particular, did many of the things. His transport czar, Jeannette Sadiq-Khan, has done many of similar things to what we're doing. If you look at other big cities, São Paulo in Brazil, most of the big cities in France have recently elected ecological administrations under the green administrations run by the Ecologist Party of France. And so you see it in Germany as well, of course, in Scandinavia, in the Netherlands, but it's a growing trend toward pedestrianization, toward creating a city at the human scale where everything isn't focused around the automobile. One of the things that we did during the pandemic was to pedestrianize a close to 3-kilometer stretch of Mont-Royal Avenue. There again, it was a bit controversial, but at the time, we seized the opportunity because there was a need for social distancing. And now, we're in our 3rd year of that pedestrianization project. It is, to the best of our knowledge, the longest pedestrianized street in North America. And the majority of the merchants love it. And they're actually complaining that we shut it down too early. They would like to extend it into the fall now. We did, for the first time this summer, we pedestrianized a stretch of Duluth Avenue as well. So, yeah, I've been talking a while, and I see I have 2 minutes left. So there are many things I could talk about. I could talk about police oversight as well. That was a role I played in the last mandate. My new role as majority leader at City Council has me, gives me the responsibility to shepherd the legislative agenda of our citywide administration through city council, the agglomeration council, the executive committee, and so on. So I still have my oar in many different issues and enjoy taking part in debate at the executive committee. But why don't we call that, I'll wrap it up there and open things up to questions, and be keen to hear what you have to say, and be happy to answer your questions. So thank you for your attention, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Much appreciated. I have a couple of questions, but first I'll just, is there anybody else that would like to start? Because when I get started, I don't stop.
I'll start. Thank you very much, Alex, for the work you've done on the bicycle infrastructure on the plateau. It's remarkable how good it is, and I wish the entire city was like that. Which brings me to my favorite street now in Montreal is Rue Saint-Denis, and I wish that was the arterial model for all the arterial streets. Do you think how quickly will you expand this REV network and bringing the bicycle paths up in standard from bi-directional, which primarily what we have in Montreal, which was sort of an old style design, to expanding the number of streets and bringing them up to this unidirectional ones that they have to the standard that have it on Rue Saint-Denis?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. McRae, for your comments. And yes, you're quite right that the new gold standard for biking infrastructure is to have unidirectional lanes that move in the same direction as the direction of the vehicular traffic. Bidirectional bike lanes are problematic because they're difficult for motorists to cross or to turn through. When you have to look both ways. If you're crossing a street that has a bidirectional lane, first of all, you're looking at the sidewalk, then you're looking at the two lanes in each direction of vehicular traffic, and then you have to look at two lanes of bike traffic, and then the sidewalk. So it's a bit chaotic, and it does make intuitive sense to channel all the traffic that's moving in one direction on one side of the street and all the traffic moving in the other direction on the other side of the street, and it has been demonstrated to be considerably safer for there are fewer collisions between cyclists and motorists, and so yes, we do want to expand this model throughout the city. Already, we've given a contract for a portion of Henri Bourassa on the West Island, and we expect to extend that across the city. I know that in the initial plan that we announced, Jean Talon is one of the streets that we feel could use such treatment. It's certainly one of the reasons that we chose Saint-Denis is that you really can't argue that, for one thing, Saint-Denis is a very wide street, so there was room. It had two lanes in each direction, 2 lanes of traffic plus a parking lane. So we bumped the parking lane out into the middle lane and created nice, super wide, comfortable, all ages, all abilities, unidirectional bike lanes between the sidewalk and the parking lane. And there were predictions of disaster, catastrophe for business, and so on. But in fact, the vacancy rate has dropped on Saint-Denis. Business is picking up on Saint-Denis, and this is something that's been experienced by commercial streets around the world. When you put in biking infrastructure, it's actually good for businesses because cyclists actually spend more money on a commercial street than motorists. It's easier for them to stop. It's not, you don't have to look for parking as much, so they buy smaller amounts but more frequently on commercial streets than motorists. And of course, they don't have many of them don't have the huge expense drain on their finances that owning a car represents. So yes, thank you for your comments. I agree, and I'm definitely pushing internally for us to move as swiftly as possible in putting in a comprehensive network of Réseau Express Vélo unidirectional bike lanes. The Saint-Antoine, Viger, lane is being put in as we speak. It's not complete yet, but that will certainly help people who want to go downtown from the southwest. But I agree, we need these all over the city, and we need them to be on streets that offer good connectivity. You know, saying some people would argue, oh, they should go put the cyclists on side streets or on residential streets. We don't agree with this because it also has to do with the makeup of the city of Montreal. Because of the rail lines that cross our city, many of our boroughs are enclaves that are surrounded by rail lines or other physical obstacles. And so if you want, you know, cyclists are like anyone else, they'll take the most direct route possible. Yes, the Réseau Express Vélo has been a huge success. It's now, you know, seen as something of a reference to people who come. We had a delegation from Bordeaux, which has a newly elected green administration. We're very interested in our Réseau Express Vélo and told us they're putting in their own, they also call it a Réseau Express Vélo. Yes, we're very keen on this, and we certainly need public support. Because there typically is something of a backlash if, you know, you reduce the amount of space dedicated to traffic, to cars, and give it over to other uses. Not everyone is always happy, but I think that by and large, the majority of the merchants on Saint Denis have come around and are quite delighted with the renewal that they're seeing on that street.
Okay, Alex, thank you. I'm going to ask Rod de Courcy Ireland now to step in.
Well, thank you for your comments. I must admit, as an older gentleman who's not in the best of health, and certainly beyond the days of riding a bicycle, it's frustrating to see bicyclists, for instance, on Sherbrooke Street, when the original bike lane on de Maisonneuve, you know, is 1 block south and dedicated to their use. You might even comment on the ability of cyclists to obey the rules of the road, which I'm sure in Europe they'd be getting tickets if they tried doing some of the things that our local bicyclists do. Thank you.
Sure, I think that's a question that often arises, and obviously cyclists have the same obligation to respect the Quebec Highway Code and the rules of the road as all other users of the roadway, and we would never argue otherwise. And my own experience as you know, a Four Seasons cyclist and a non-car owner who's been using a bike as my main means of transport for the last 35 years in Montreal is that with the growth in cycling infrastructure, that the behavior of cyclists has improved. You know, back in the day when there were fewer of us and we were alone against the world, or that's how we felt, that there was very little cycling infrastructure, that I think that there was more of a tendency to, you know, burn through red lights, to, you know, you were taking more of your life into your hands by getting on a bike 30 years ago than you are today. And so, but certainly we do need all enforcement across the board for motorists, for cyclists, particularly for motorists, because they do pose a much graver hazard to the safety of people. And you have to look at the statistics. Yes, occasionally a pedestrian is hit by a bike, and I won't deny that a bike can be dangerous, but the vast majority of people who are injured on the roadway are injured by motorized vehicles. And so the emphasis still needs to be there. The question that sometimes arises, is this ageist? Are we neglecting the elderly, people with physical limitations, the handicapped? I would argue no, because one of the big thrusts of our administration has been to make sidewalks safer as well, and intersections safer. Those big generous curb extensions you see at many intersections throughout the plateau, you know, those make our roadways much safer for pedestrians. And if you look at the people who are injured in the types of people who are injured, pedestrians who are injured at intersections, it's really disproportionately elderly people. So to the extent that we improve visibility at intersections and we you know, we create safe crosswalks, and that benefits the elderly, the people with reduced. Sorry, I'm used to speaking French on this vocabulary, but mobilité réduite, reduced mobility, it benefits everybody. And certainly, with the pedestrianization of Mont-Royal Avenue, a bus route got shifted north onto Saint-Joseph, but we did offer a free service for elderly people and handicapped people, a free rickshaw service for people who needed to get around on Mount Royal and who lived in the vicinity. So there definitely are solutions, but pedestrian safety, remains uppermost among our concerns, and I wouldn't want to oppose cyclist safety against pedestrian safety. These are compatible causes. In my view, and these are battles that need to be fought simultaneously.
Alex, I'd like to come back to something that you mentioned, saying that how a lot of businesses have seen their sales increase. Are there any hard numbers for any given district or a given block or a village that say this is what has happened to business since these things have been done?
Yes, there is. I mean, I can't cite I don't have them at hand, but the business development corporations, or SDCs, as we call them, Société de Développement Commercial, that represent businesses on a number of our commercial arteries have done studies. We also and we also hired researchers at the Polytechnique to look at the transport aspect of these pedestrianizations, but yeah, the majority, certainly the majority of the merchants on Mount Royal, and a growing majority, are favorable to these pedestrianizations and see them as having improved their bottom line. I can't give you the precise figures, however, and it's certainly not the case for everybody, and we don't deny that. It's not a quick fix for everybody, particularly destination businesses that have a market that's broader than just the neighborhood. These do present challenges for, and in some cases, businesses have to adjust their business model. But overall, it's hard to argue that that because of these changes, the plateau is an economic catastrophe. We actually, we have probably one of the most lively and healthy local economies anywhere in the province. Certainly in Saint-Viateur East is a major employment hub that has attracted a lot of big employers, particularly in the visual arts and so on. Part of that has to do with another move we made, which was to protect artist studios, to use our urban planning bylaws as leverage to protect creative people who were at risk of being pushed out of the neighborhood because of gentrification, because of the economic boom that we've seen on the plateau. And that ended up making these employment hubs more attractive to particular types of employers. So yeah, I mean, we do see hard figures in terms of the vacancy rate having dropped on Saint-Denis. The vacancy rate on Mount Royal Avenue has historically been lower than the average among commercial arteries in the city, and remains so. Saint Laurent Boulevard has been a bit more of a challenge, but there again, it compares favorably with many other commercial arteries in the city.
Thank you. Last chance for questions. Does anybody else have something to say? Okay, then.
I just make a comment about the pedestrianized streets. My favorite pedestrianized street is Wellington Street.
Yeah.
And my least favorite is around Place des Spectacles. And I think there was an old school thinking that cycling and pedestrians can't mix together. And I noticed that, like this year, I believe it was the first year where they actually permitted certain streets to allow it to mix, and I think it's gone over very well. And
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you. Yes, Wellington has been a huge success. It was just recently deemed the coolest street in the world by Time Out magazine. And certainly, now I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse, because it will certainly probably fuel gentrification and might help end up serving, kind of paradoxically serving to make it more difficult for the more vulnerable residents, the poorer residents, to stay in the neighborhood, which is not what we want. But yes, this was an innovation. We'd found that, we had difficulty enforcing the rules that segregated cyclists from pedestrians and kept cyclists off Mont-Royal Avenue. And so we tried something new by having what we call a zone lenteur, where you go slowly. And you keep your distance from pedestrians. Not everyone's happy with it. Some pedestrians find it quite destabilizing to have bikes going by them, and there's a minority of cyclists, unfortunately, that don't respect the rules. And so we're going to do a post-mortem on all of that and see whether we will continue with that pilot project next summer. But I'm inclined to think that overall it's been a success. Certainly, I haven't had many complaints about it, to be honest, as a councillor. But there are some people, I acknowledge, that aren't comfortable with it. So I think, it's likely that we'll pursue it, but the jury's still out. We're gonna do a careful, sober assessment of that experience and see whether we renew it. But thank you for your comments.
So if we've learned anything today, we've learned that we're going to have you back again, because there's about 22 other topics that we never even got to touch on.
That's right.
And I think there's an awful lot of good discussion left to have.
It would be my pleasure.
Oh, good. I was told by a city councillor about 20 years ago, who said that the toughest job in politics is to be a municipal politician.
Well,
You are so close to the people. They have immediate access, direct access to you. You cannot hide. And if you're not out there doing your thing, you're going to get burned really fast. And it sounds like you've been out doing your thing. And despite as you say, some of the backlash that you've experienced over the years, everybody can see the change in Montreal over the last 10, 15 years in terms of bicycles and parks and the sidewalks and so on and so forth. You see it happening everywhere. So congratulations to you for your perseverance and your success during that time. Thank you very, very much for spending your time with us today. And we're going to go on with the rest of our meeting. You're free to stay if you would like to, but if you'd like to go off and get your lunch and get back onto the street to speak to your constituents, we will not be insulted.
I might just do that. Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me and for your interesting questions. I really enjoyed it, and it would be my pleasure to come back sometime if you want to have me. So it was an honor to speak to you, and thank you for all your good work. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have further questions or want to have me again to your group. Thanks for everything.
Thanks again. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.